Imagine a single button that could disconnect an entire country from the world's economy. A switch that could stop the flow of money in and out, essentially putting a nation in financial solitary confinement. Well, on February 26, 2022, just 2 days after Russia invaded Ukraine, the United States and the European Union decided to press that button. They announced that major Russian banks would be cut off from something called SWIFT. Now, SWIFT is a name you might have heard, but most people don't know what it really is. It stands for the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication. But forget the fancy name. Think of it like the private, super secure text messaging app for the entire global banking system. It connects over 11,000 banks in 200 different countries, and it handles the messages for an unbelievable $5 trillion worth of transactions every single day. Cutting Russia off was meant to be the financial equivalent of a nuclear bomb. It meant Russian banks couldn't easily send or receive money internationally. No paying for imports, no getting paid for exports. It was designed to cause total economic isolation. In the West, leaders celebrated. This was the ultimate sanction, the move that would cripple Russia's economy, cause the ruble to collapse into dust, and force Vladimir Putin to either pull his troops out of Ukraine or face a revolution from his own people. But fast forward, and a completely different story has unfolded. Russia didn't collapse. In fact, after an initial shock, its currency, the ruble, recovered. Trade continued, just not through the usual channels. Russia and its partners got creative and found alternatives. And this is where the story gets really dangerous for the West. Dozens of other countries were watching this unfold, and they all had the same thought. If the United States can unplug a major power like Russia from the world's financial grid for political reasons, they could do it to anyone. They could do it to us. This move wasn't a brilliant new strategy. It was actually a very old mistake. This is the fourth time in just over a century that a dominant global power has tried to use its control over the financial system as a weapon. And every single time, the same five-stage pattern plays out. The big power flexes its financial muscles to punish an enemy. The country being punished is forced to invent workarounds. Other neutral countries see this and get nervous, so they start quietly building their own backup systems. And over time, the weapon that seemed so powerful becomes weaker and weaker, because people have found ways to route around it. The dominant power thinks it's showing strength, but what it's really doing is giving the rest of the world a reason to stop depending on it, eroding the very foundation of its own power. When Britain tried this back in 1914, its currency was the king of the world. By 1944, just 30 years later, it had lost that status to the US dollar. Well, the US weaponized SWIFT and the dollar system in 2022. The clock is officially ticking. And this time, things could happen much, much faster because the technology to build new systems already exists. Before we get into how this all backfired, let's be crystal clear on what SWIFT is and what it isn't. It's not a bank. It doesn't hold or transfer a single dollar. SWIFT is purely a messaging system. When a bank in New York needs to send $1 million to a bank in Tokyo, it doesn't put cash on a plane. It sends a highly secure, standardized message through the SWIFT network that basically says, "We're good for the money, go ahead and credit their account." SWIFT is the trusted middleman that makes sure the message is authentic and gets to the right place. Without it, international finance would grind to a halt. It became the nervous system of global finance because it was reliable and, importantly, it was supposed to be neutral. It's based in Belgium. But here's the catch. Its board is filled with American and European bankers. And because most global trade is still priced in US dollars, most payments have to pass through New York banks, giving the US government incredible leverage. They can pressure SWIFT to do what they want. We've seen this before. Back in 2012, the US leaned on SWIFT to disconnect Iranian banks to punish them for their nuclear program. It was devastating for Iran. Their oil exports collapsed because buyers had no way to pay them. The economy shrank and inflation skyrocketed. From the outside, it looked like the weapon worked perfectly. But under the surface, Iran spent years learning how to survive without SWIFT, setting up barter deals, using cryptocurrency, and trading directly with countries like China and Russia in other currencies. But cutting off Russia in 2022 was a different game entirely. This wasn't a smaller, isolated economy like Iran's. This was the world's 11th largest economy, a giant energy supplier with a permanent seat on the UN Security Council. Kicking Russia out of the club wasn't just a sanction. It was a loud and clear declaration to the entire world that the global financial system was no longer neutral territory. The message was simple. If you step out of line with US policy, your country's economic life support can be switched off. This forced every non-Western nation to ask a very uncomfortable question. Do we want to live in a world where our entire economy is permanently vulnerable to the political whims of another country? Or is it time to start building our own system? The vast majority chose to start building. And that is the exact moment the West's ultimate weapon started to blow up in its own face. You might think this is a brand new problem, a unique situation with Russia, but it's not. History is littered with examples of this same mistake. It's like watching the same movie on repeat, and the ending is always the same. The superpower that tries to use its financial dominance as a weapon ends up weakening itself. It's a predictable pattern, and it has played out time and time again. Let's rewind the clock to our first example, Great Britain during World War I. Back in 1914, London was the New York City of the world, the undisputed king of global finance. The British pound wasn't just a currency, it was the currency. If you wanted to do big business anywhere in the world, you did it in pounds sterling. But when the war broke out, Britain did something that shocked the international community. They passed a law called the Trading with the Enemy Act. For centuries, there had been an unwritten rule among nations. Soldiers fight on the battlefield, but bankers honor their contracts. Money was supposed to be separate from war. Britain tore up that rulebook. They started freezing and seizing German-owned businesses, bank accounts, and even ships all across their vast empire. For Germany, it was an economic catastrophe. But other countries, the ones not even in the war, were watching with wide eyes. They realized something terrifying. The lesson was crystal clear. Your money isn't truly yours if it's sitting in a London bank. If the British government decides they don't like your politics, they can just take it. Suddenly, London didn't feel so safe anymore. After the war, these neutral countries started quietly moving their money around, diversifying their holdings. They bought more gold, which no government could freeze with the stroke of a pen. They started opening accounts in other cities like New York and Paris. They were hedging their bets. And who benefited the most from this fear? The United States. New York banks started getting all this business that used to belong exclusively to London. Britain's power move had accidentally created its biggest rival. Just 30 years later, the US dollar officially took the crown from the British pound as the world's reserve currency. Britain's attempt to use finance as a weapon in 1914 kicked off its own 30-year slide from the top. You see the pattern? They controlled the system, they weaponized it, and in doing so, they gave everyone else a powerful reason to find an alternative. Now, let's jump forward to 1979, for example. Number 2, the US is now the top dog, and it's about to make the same mistake. When Iranian revolutionaries stormed the US embassy and took American hostages, President Jimmy Carter responded with overwhelming financial force. He froze every single dollar of Iranian government money held in US banks, a staggering $12 billion. At the time, this was the largest asset freeze in history. On the surface, it seemed justified. Iran had broken international law, and the US was defending its citizens. But just like with Britain, the rest of the world saw the hidden message. Countries across the globe, especially the big oil producers in the Middle East, had a sudden, chilling realization. Their nation's savings, their sovereign wealth, wasn't actually sovereign at all if it was held in US dollars. The President of the United States could, with a single phone call, lock them out of their own money. The dollar's safety was no longer guaranteed. It was conditional. Tactically, the freeze worked to put pressure on Iran. But strategically, it taught the world a lesson it would never forget. Don't put all your eggs in the American basket. And that brings us to the third example, which was really the dress rehearsal for what we're seeing today. The US and Russia in 2014. After Russia annexed Crimea, the US responded with sanctions. But these were carefully targeted. They went after a few key individuals and banks, but deliberately didn't use the nuclear option of cutting Russia off from SWIFT. The idea was to send a strong warning without starting an all-out financial war. This turned out to be a massive strategic blunder. Why? Because it was like showing your enemy your most powerful weapon, but not firing it. It gave Russia an 8-year head start to prepare for the day when the US would tasodai pull the trigger. And prepare, they did. Between 2014 and 2022, Russia went on a mission to make its economy sanction-proof. They sold off almost all of their US government bonds. They went on a gold-buying spree, more than doubling their reserves. They built their very own version of SWIFT, a backup system just in case. Most importantly, they worked tirelessly to sign trade deals with China, India, and others that would let them buy and sell goods in their own local currencies, instead of dollars. All the while, Vladimir Putin was giving speeches, telling the world exactly what he was doing and why. He said the US uses the dollar as a weapon, and Russia needed to be independent. Most experts in the West just rolled their eyes, dismissing it as tough talk. They thought Russia was too tangled up in the global economy to ever truly break away. They were wrong. Russia was deadly serious. And when the full force of the financial hammer came down in 2022, they were ready. That cautious, middle-of-the-road approach from 2014, it turned out to be the worst possible choice. It was like warning a boxer that you're going to throw a knockout punch in the next round, giving him plenty of time to get his guard up. And that brings us to the main event, our fourth and final example, the United States versus Russia in 2022. This is the big one. This is the moment the financial world changed forever. On February 26th, the West didn't just warn Russia, they dropped the financial nuclear bomb. Major Russian banks were unplugged from SWIFT, but they went even further. They froze $300 billion of Russia's own central bank reserves. To put that in perspective, imagine your country's entire national savings account, money held in other countries for safekeeping, was suddenly locked. You can see the balance, but you can't touch a single penny. It was an unprecedented move designed to cause total, immediate collapse. And at first, it looked like it was working perfectly. The ruble crashed, losing 30% of its value in just 2 days. The Russian stock market slammed shut to stop the bleeding. Across the country, people panicked, lining up at ATMs that were quickly running out of cash. Western media and politicians declared a swift and total economic victory. Russia, they said, would be brought to its knees within months. But then, the story took a sharp, unexpected turn. Russia didn't collapse. It stabilized. The Russian central bank, in a bold move, cranked interest rates up to a sky-high 20%, which stopped the free fall of their currency. Then, they did something truly clever. They demanded that all unfriendly European countries start paying for their natural gas in rubles. This created a huge artificial demand for their currency, forcing their customers to buy rubles and drive the price back up. Within just 3 months, the ruble had recovered all of its losses and was even stronger than before the invasion. And what about trade? It just found new roads. Russia simply turned its ships and pipelines eastward, selling its oil and gas to China, India, and countries in the Middle East. And they weren't getting paid in dollars. They settled their deals in Chinese yuan, Indian rupees, and Russian rubles. By the end of the year, the Russian economy was doing better than Germany's or the UK's. But the real, lasting damage wasn't to the Russian economy. The real damage was to the trust in the US dollar and the SWIFT system. Every other country on the planet was watching this drama, and they all understood the terrifying new reality. The United States was willing and able to freeze a country's national savings and disconnect it from the world for political reasons. Leaders in Beijing, Riyadh, New Delhi, and Brasilia all started asking the same scary question. What if we disagree with the US tomorrow? A dispute over trade? A conflict in our region? Could our $1 trillion in savings be frozen? Could our banks be unplugged? The answer, after what happened to Russia, was an obvious and resounding yes. And this is where the predictable 5-stage pattern of self-destruction always begins. This is how a financial weapon backfires every single time. Stage 1. The dominant power controls the payment system. For the last 50 years, that has been the United States. Now, they don't technically own SWIFT, but because the US dollar is the oxygen of global trade, almost every major transaction has to pass through New York. This gives the US government the power to tell SWIFT who's in and who's out. Stage 2. The dominant power weaponizes that control. Since 9/11, the US has gotten more and more comfortable using financial sanctions. At first, it was for tracking down terrorist money. Then it was for punishing rogue states like Iran and North Korea. Using this weapon became normal. So when Russia invaded Ukraine, pushing the big red SWIFT button seemed like the logical next step. Stage 3, the target is forced to find alternatives. With the front door to global finance slammed in its face, Russia simply went around to the back. It started using its own little-known SWIFT alternative. It relied heavily on China's rival payment system called CIPS. It used cryptocurrency and even old-fashioned barter deals. Russia proved to the world that you could get kicked out of the most exclusive financial club on earth and not only survive, but find new, powerful friends. Stage 4. Neutral countries start to hedge their bets. This is the most important stage. This is where the real damage happens. It's not just about Russia. It's about dozens of other countries that aren't being punished, but are terrified they might be next. They start buying financial insurance. China, for example, saw what happened and put its plan to move away from the dollar into overdrive. They've been dumping US government debt and buying massive amounts of physical gold, something you can hold in your own vaults. And then there's Saudi Arabia, a loyal US ally for 80 years. They saw those Russian reserves get frozen and had a serious moment of doubt. They did something that broke a 50-year-old agreement that formed the bedrock of the dollar's power. They announced they would start selling oil to China and accepting Chinese yuan as payment. Other allies, like the UAE, started doing trade deals with India in their own currencies, completely bypassing the dollar. It's a slow-motion bank run, not by people, but by entire countries. And this fear is spreading like wildfire. We're now seeing a global scramble for a Plan B, the group of nations known as BRICS, which now includes major players like Saudi Arabia and the UAE, is openly working on building its own shared payment system. They're even talking about creating a new currency, one backed by real things like gold and oil, not just the promise of one government. Even close allies of the United States are getting nervous and quietly building their own lifeboats. The European Union, Japan, South Korea, they're all finding ways to be a little less dependent on the dollar. This isn't because they've suddenly become anti-American. It's simple, cold-hearted risk management. They saw a G20 nation's $300 billion vanish with an executive order, and they realized their own savings might not be safe either. Which brings us to stage 5, the final act in this historical drama. The original weapon loses its power, and this is exactly where we are right now. Look, SWIFT is still the biggest player on the field, and the dollar is still the world's most used currency. But their dominance is visibly shrinking. In 1999, over 70% of the world's emergency savings were held in US dollars. Today, that number has fallen below 59%. That's a massive shift, representing trillions of dollars that have moved out of the US system. Even more shocking is what's happening in global trade. Just 2 years ago, the dollar was used to settle nearly 3/4 of all international transactions. Now, it's closer to half. That is the fastest move away from the dollar in modern history. Meanwhile, all those little alternative systems are growing at lightning speed. While SWIFT is still growing, its share of the pie is getting smaller as competitors like China's CIPS are seeing 50% growth in a single year. The weapon still works, but it's getting weaker with every use. It's like a magic spell that loses a little bit of its magic each time it's cast. The United States went through stage 1, controlling the system. It went through stage 2, weaponizing it. We've seen stage 3, where the target, Russia, found alternatives. We're deep into stage 4, as neutral countries all over the world hedge their bets. And now we are living in stage 5, watching the weapon lose its power. Britain went through this exact cycle, and it took 30 years. The US started its clock in 2022. Now let me show you the hard data, the black and white proof that this is happening right now. These aren't theories or predictions. These are the facts on the ground. Let's start with Russia's trade. Before the big sanctions, almost all of Russia's business was done in US dollars or euros. Today, nearly half of it is done in other currencies like the Chinese yuan, Russian rupees, and Indian rupees. Russia has become the world's biggest test case, proving that a major economy can operate and trade globally outside the dollar system. Next, look at China's payment system, CIPS. Think of it as China's answer to SWIFT. Just a few years ago, it was a minor player. Today, it's connected to over 1,400 banks in more than 100 countries, and the amount of money flowing through it has more than doubled in 3 years. It is a direct competitor to the dollar-based system, and it is growing at an explosive rate. Now, follow the gold. In the last few years, the world's central banks have been buying physical gold at the fastest pace since the 1970s, which, not coincidentally, was right before the last major shift in the global financial system. And who's buying? It's a long list. China, Russia, India, Turkey, and even countries in Europe. Why are they doing this? Because you can't freeze or sanction a bar of gold that's sitting in your own vault. It is the ultimate financial insurance. Then there's the death of the petrodollar monopoly. For 50 years, a simple rule governed the world. If you wanted to buy oil, you needed US dollars. This created a constant, massive global demand for American currency. But that ironclad rule is now broken. Saudi Arabia now sells its oil to China for yuan. Russia sells to India for rupees. The UAE is using its own currency. The petrodollar isn't dead yet, but its monopoly is over. And in economics, once a monopoly shatters, the power it granted disappears very, very quickly. Finally, look at the BRICS alliance. This group of nations now represents nearly half the world's population and over a third of its economy. They are not just talking. They're actively building the architecture of a parallel financial world, one that doesn't depend on the dollar or SWIFT. The data is overwhelming. The move away from the dollar isn't some distant threat that might happen one day. It is happening right now at a speed that nobody thought was possible. This isn't a slow leak anymore. It's a dam that's starting to show serious cracks. The move away from the dollar is happening, and it's picking up speed. Every single month, the dollar's share of the world's savings ticks down. Every quarter, China's rival payment system grows bigger. Every year, more and more global trade is done without a single dollar ever changing hands. The West's ultimate financial weapon didn't just backfire, it shattered the very monopoly that made it so powerful in the first place. This brings us to the most important question of all. How long does the US have before the dollar loses its crown? We can actually get a pretty good estimate by looking at the last time this happened. And when Britain made its big mistake back in 1914 by seizing enemy assets, its currency was the king of the world. By 1944, just 30 years later, the British pound had officially handed over that crown to the US dollar, a 30-year slide from the top. Now, you could argue that the decline for the US will be slower. After all, Britain was devastated by 2 world wars that drained its treasury and broke its empire. The US isn't facing that kind of challenge. But there's another, much more powerful force at play here: technology. Think about it. Building a new financial railroad in 1914 took decades of laying track, building stations, and establishing trust. Today, you can build a digital payment system that reaches the entire globe in just a few years. China's system scaled from handling $12 trillion to $27 trillion in just 3 years. Technology changes the game and makes everything happen exponentially faster. So when you balance those factors, the timeline is likely somewhere between 15 and 25 years from the moment the weapon was fired in 2022. That means we could see the dollar lose its undisputed top spot somewhere between 2037 and 2047. Now, that doesn't mean the dollar becomes worthless, but it does mean it goes from being the sun that the entire financial solar system revolves around to being just one of several large planets. We're heading toward a world with multiple major currencies: the dollar, the euro, the yuan, all competing for influence. And here's what that actually means for the average person. Right now, the United States gets what economists call an exorbitant privilege. It's like having a magic credit card with no limit and almost no interest, because the whole world needs our dollars for trade and savings. This lets the US government spend trillions more than it takes in year after year. But when the world no longer needs dollars in the same way, that privilege vanishes. The demand for our government bonds will collapse. Interest rates will have to skyrocket to attract buyers. Suddenly, that magic credit card bill comes due. The American standard of living, which has been propped up for decades by our ability to import mountains of goods and pay for them with freshly printed money, becomes impossible to maintain. It is the end of the great American free lunch. So, in this great financial reshuffling, who ends up with the winning hand, and who is left holding the bag? The biggest winner, without a doubt, is China. It's perfectly positioned to become the next financial superpower. It's already the world's factory with the largest volume of trade. It has a ready-made, swift alternative in SIPs. It has a currency, the yuan, that's being used more and more. And it's been hoarding gold for years. China doesn't need to win a war against the US. It just has to sit back and watch as America's own actions speed up the dollar's decline. Russia also wins, but strategically. Russia proved to the world that you can take the West's biggest financial punch and stay on your feet. That single act destroyed the myth that the US had absolute financial power over everyone. Russia became the kid who stood up to the bully and didn't get knocked out. Now, everyone else on the playground is feeling a little bit braver. The BRICS nations and other middle powers win big time too. For decades, they had to play by America's rules. Now they have options. They can choose to do business in dollars, yuan, or their own currencies. It gives them incredible new leverage. India is the perfect example. They kept buying cheap Russian oil despite US pressure, paid for it in their own currency, and faced no real punishment. That is the future for dozens of countries. More freedom and less dependence on Washington. And of course, gold wins. In times of uncertainty, when people lose faith in government-printed money, they always run back to gold. It's the one asset that can't be frozen or devalued with a keystroke. So, who loses? The United States. Not overnight, not in a fiery collapse, but gradually and irreversibly. It loses its position as the undisputed leader of the world. The dollar's special status is the secret foundation of so much of America's global power. It's what allows for a massive military budget. It's what makes sanctions so terrifying. It's what lets the entire country live beyond its means. As the dollar's dominance fades, all of those advantages begin to evaporate. And this loss of status isn't some abstract concept for politicians and economists to worry about. It will fundamentally change the country. That magic credit card I mentioned, the one that lets America borrow and spend trillions of dollars, it gets cut up. The military, with its globe-spanning bases and advanced technology, becomes far too expensive to maintain without that endless line of credit. The American standard of living, built on a mountain of cheap imported goods, begins to slide. This doesn't mean America becomes a poor country, but it does mean America becomes a normal country. A big, wealthy, powerful nation, yes, but no longer the untouchable hyperpower that writes the rules for everyone else. And America won't be the only one losing. Europe loses too. European nations essentially hitched their wagon to the American star. They enthusiastically joined the sanctions, froze the assets, and cut Russia off from SWIFT, tying their economic fate directly to the US dollar system. The euro had the potential to be a real alternative, a safe harbor for countries looking to diversify. But instead of charting their own course, European leaders chose to follow Washington's lead. And now, as the dollar system weakens, The euro isn't automatically rising to take its place. The yuan is. Europe may find itself caught in the middle, a junior partner to a declining America and a rising China. SWIFT itself, the company at the heart of this story, is in deep trouble. While it's officially based in neutral Belgium, the world now sees it for what it is, a tool of Western foreign policy. Its entire business model is based on being the one essential highway for global money. But as dozens of countries start building their own financial highways, SWIFT's traffic will decline. It won't disappear overnight, but it will go from being the global standard to just one of several competing options. But the biggest losers of all will be ordinary people holding dollars. That means anyone with savings in a U.S. bank or investments in U.S. bonds. The value of that money is going to steadily erode. Not through some dramatic overnight collapse, but through a persistent, nagging inflation that eats away at your wealth year after year. Imagine your savings account earning you 4% interest, but the dollar is losing 7% of its value on the world stage. You're getting poorer every single day. And for American consumers, the change will be felt at the cash register. For decades, America has been able to import far more than it exports, paying for all those cars, electronics, and clothes with dollars that the rest of the world was happy to take. When that demand for dollars dries up, the prices of everything we buy from other countries will shoot up. The era of cheap stuff will be over, so the timeline is already in motion. The financial weapon was fired in 2022. That single act triggered the 5-stage pattern of self-destruction that is repeated throughout history. We are watching the dominoes fall right now, and here's the ultimate irony in all of this. The SWIFT weapon, that button that looked so powerful in February 2022, was like a bee's stinger. You can use it once, and it's incredibly painful for the victim. But in the process, you lose the stinger forever. After you use a weapon like that, everyone in the world immediately starts building armor against it. Russia built its alternatives. China accelerated its own plans. The BRICS nations expanded. The petrodollar monopoly was broken. And now, the weapon is basically useless because any country the US might want to target in the future has seen what's coming and is already preparing its defenses. The United States could have kept its dominant position for decades longer, simply by being the most reliable, open, and trustworthy place to do business. Instead, it chose to turn the dollar into a tool of coercion. That strategy backfired in the most spectacular way possible. It's not just Russia looking for an exit, it's more than half the world. The pattern is undeniable. Britain weaponized its financial power in 1914 and lost its top spot 30 years later. The US did the same in 2022. The clock is ticking. And the country that benefits most from all this is the one that did nothing at all, China. The patient rival that simply sat back and watched as America dismantled the very source of its own global power. The 5-stage pattern is now almost complete. The end of the dollar's unchallenged reign isn't coming with a military defeat. It's coming through a slow, self-inflicted financial wound. The world has learned its lesson, and that lesson is simple. Build your own system, trust your own currency, and never again be vulnerable to the whims of a single country. So, if you've been watching all of this and a light bulb has gone on in your head, if you now understand that financial weapons don't work the way their users think they do, if you recognize that the decision to cut Russia off from SWIFT wasn't the moment of America's maximum power, but the moment it started giving that power away, then you now hold the key to understanding the next 20 years of world history. The future of geopolitics will be defined by this single irreversible trend. The US dollar will continue its slow decline, the Chinese yuan will continue its steady rise, and the world will become a far more complex, multipolar place. The United States will find itself less powerful, less able to call the shots. And the most crucial thing to understand is that this isn't happening because of some brilliant strategy from China or a military threat from Russia. It's happening because of America's own choices. For decades, the United States held the keys to the global economy. It controlled the system that everyone needed to use. It was like owning the only bridge into the most prosperous city in the world. Anyone who wanted to do business had to cross that bridge and pay the toll. But instead of just collecting the toll, America started closing the bridge to its enemies. It showed the world that access wasn't a right. It was a privilege that could be revoked at any moment. And so the rest of the world, logically, started building its own bridges. They're not as big or as busy as the American bridge yet, but more of them are being built every year. And with each new bridge that opens, the original one becomes a little less essential, a little less powerful. The dollar system was the golden goose of American power. It laid golden eggs in the form of endless credit, global influence, and a high standard of living. And with the stroke of a pen in 2022, the United States chose to strangle that goose, hoping to punish an enemy. We are now heading into a post-dollar world. It hasn't fully arrived yet, but we are well on our way. The foundations are shifting beneath our feet. The pattern is crystal clear, and the timeline is already set. The day the swift weapon was fired against a major world power was the starting pistol for the end of an era.